Hello YouTube. Yesterday, Dow Jones Industrial Average had one of its worst point drops in history. At one point, I think it dropped close to 1,000 points. It recovered a little bit towards the end of the session, but still, it was a big reaction from the market. And the mainstream media, of course, and also the administration of the US attribute to the bloodbath in the stock market to the news that the yuan had broken a very psychological level of 7 to 1 in exchange to the US dollar, a level that hasn't been broken for the past 10 years, since 2008, since the economic crisis of 2008. And I just want to give you a perspective from someone, who knows China a lot. I used to live in China. I worked in China for 5.5 years, and last summer, the summer of 2018, I was in Hangzhou. I was in China for 2.5 months. And I just want to give you a perspective of someone like me, and I can tell you that the Chinese economy is more resilient than many people, including the US administration, gives it credit for. So I don't see that the devaluation of the yuan against the dollar is the deliberate move from the Chinese government to gain leverage in the trade war as a retaliation to the slapping on of the latest round of tariffs by the US. And the reason I say that is because export has becoming less and less of an economic engine to China, to the Chinese economy in the last 10 years. Maybe 20 years ago, yes, China considers export, especially to the US, is a critical part of its success, of its economy. But for the past 10 years, China has done a really good job developing its own middle class. Right now, there are over 300 million middle class in China. That's more than the entire population of the US. So China has developed a tremendous internal demand for its goods and services. It's less reliant on economies in the West, like the US and the EU, to consume the products that were produced by the Chinese factories. So yes, the US had slapped 10% of tariffs on the remaining $300 billion of Chinese exports. But China is not really concerned about that. To me, the Chinese leadership has a more long-term and more strategic agenda. And that is, China wants to eventually replace the US as the predominant hegemony in the world. And one critical step that the Chinese leadership sees en route to that goal is to first replace the US dollar, have the RMB to replace the US dollar as the world reserve currency. America, of course, the US dollar has remained as the world reserve currency since the end of World War II, since the Bretton Woods system was established in 1944. And the US had enjoyed that reserve currency status for over 70 years. And it has served the US really well. Even though, we don't produce a lot of goods, we don't produce the washing machines, the refrigerators, the computers, but we produce a lot of US dollars. And we export those US dollars to countries like China in exchange for their finished goods, like the washing machines, the iPhones, the iPods, and whatnot. And that in turn had increased our living standard here in the US, and also reduced the inflation. We've pretty much, exported our consumer inflation to China because we're able to print dollars, but we don't consume those dollars directly here in the US. We export those dollars to another country. And China knows that. China knows how critical it is for the RMB to replace the US dollar as the next international reserve currency. And that's why Chinese government does not want to see the yuan to weaken. It wants a very stable yuan and very strong yuan because it knows those two factors are critical for RMB to become the next international reserve currency. And a validation of that theory is that today the Chinese government came out with the support of the Chinese currency, saying that they're going to err on the stronger yuan. And you have to understand that the way Chinese government sets the exchange rate is that it creates a medium exchange price between the RMB and the US dollar. And around that medium price, the Central Bank of China allows a fluctuation range of the exchange rate. So right now, the Chinese government still sets the medium price, exchange price between the US dollar and yuan to be 6.92 to 1, 6.92 RMB to $1. But it allows 2%, plus or minus 2% of fluctuation range. So the latest round of depreciation didn't come from the come from the Chinese government. It really came from the currency traders and speculators, whether it's inside China or outside of China in the US. Because those traders and speculators, they falsely suspect that because of the latest round of tariffs slapped on Chinese exports by the US, it will force China to depreciate its currency at least by 10% to offset that tariff. I think that's false, because the speculators didn't realize that China has a long-term goal, a long-term objective, and that is to replace the US dollar as the international reserve currency. So China is not going to let its currency, the RMB, to depreciate beyond a certain point. And the latest round is not even caused by the central government of China. It's really caused by, like we discussed, by the speculators, the currency speculators, by pushing the exchange rate to that upper threshold, upper limit that was set by the Central Bank of China. So that brings back to another validation of the theories that if you look at the market of gold and silver, for example, gold and silver, the prices have been risen for the past at least half a year, and gold just reached a 6-year high in price, and silver is lagging behind, but I suspect silver will follow suit in gold and even have higher increase. And where did the demand come from? The demand didn't really come from the West, didn't come from the US for sure, I don't think. If you listen to Peter Schiff, someone whose podcast that I follow almost religiously, he made a really good point. I think in the US, a lot of people who bought gold for the past 10 years, they were Trump supporters. They were, doom and the gloomers. They believed that during Obama years, U.S. was going to collapse, and that's why many people were buying gold and silver. And once Trump became the president, was elected, those people, the demand from those people just fell off, because they believe that Trump is going to bring prosperity to America. So what's the point of buying gold as the safe haven against the potential of economic collapse? And I think the majority, because of that reason, I think the majority of the buyer really came from Asia, especially I believe come from China. Of course, I don't have any data to support, it's just a hunch. And I think China has been secretly buying gold and silver for the past 10 years, physical gold and silver. It's because China believes, I think falsely, not correctly believe, they believe that a sound currency will be backed by gold and silver, because that's the way sound currencies has always been for the past thousands of years. US dollar, as you recall, were backed by gold and silver since the inception of the republic, in the 1800s. And it wasn't until 1971 when Nixon took us out of the gold standard where gold became decoupled from the US dollar. And since then, US dollar is really backed up by the relationship US had with Saudi Arabia. So it's partly backed up, US dollar is backed up by oil, and also partly backed up by just the strength of the US economy and US military. And that's, I think that paradigm is beginning to shift. And China knows that. Russia knows that. That's why China is teaming up with Russia to try to topple the US dollar hegemony. And China believes having a RMB that's backed by gold and silver is a critical step towards that goal. And I believe it's been secretly buying gold and silver. I think they are misfounded with their intent, because I think even if China can match the gold reserve of the Fed, 8,000 tons of gold, and it buys a bunch like trillions of dollars worth of silver on top, and use those two precious metals to back the RMB, I still don't believe that's going to be enough to signal to the world that RMB is going to be the next de facto international reserve currency, because RMB is still issued by the Chinese government. It's a fiat currency. If the world someday loses its faith in the US dollar, the world is not going to succumb to the next fiat currency, especially not from China. That's why I believe back fiat currency by gold and silver is going to be false. I think to use an analogy, everything is evolving, and money is included. Money is also evolving. If you take lighting, for example, for human history, we had used the torches, we used oil lamps, used candles, we used incandescent lights, we used the halogen lights. Now we're using LEDs. So everything is moving forward. The technology is evolving, and so are the applications of those technology. Same thing with money. In the beginning we had seashells. We're trading. Or actually, in the beginning we were just bartering back and forth, trading my wheat for your cow. Trading my milk for your eggs. Then later on we say we use seashells as a medium of exchange, and that medium of exchange had evolved to gold and silver at one point, then paper money, fiats. Later on we had credit cards, we had checks, and now in China you had the WeChat Pay and the Alipay. You just scan a QR code and the transaction takes less than a second. And these are the evolution of money. But I think the trend of the evolution of money is going to be decentralization. And that's why I believe the next generation of money is going to be decentralized. It's going to be supranational. It's going to be transcend national borders, and it's going to be digital. If and when US dollar loses its international reserve currency status, the world might revert back to using or hoarding gold and silver, because gold and silver had served money for thousands of years. But the reason people do that is, because of the uncertainty. They don't know what's going to happen, what's going to replace US dollar. So the default is just to go back to something they know that's going to be stable and safe. A similar analogy is that during a blackout, people will use candles, people will use flashlights, but immediately after the electricity is restored, you will use whatever lights you use. You won't stay using candles and oil lamps, for example. Same thing with the monetary reset that's, I believe, is going to come. I don't know what the time frame, maybe in the next year, maybe in 10 years or 20 years. But I believe the trend is very clear. And China knows that, but I think China is going it the wrong way. It's using the past to predict the future. I believe the vision, what I believe the future is very similar to the vision of Dr. Lehman Beard, the founder and the inventor of the hash graph algorithm. If you listen to Dr. Beard's video, he talked elaborately about his vision of in the future, anyone can just carve out a space. What he meant by space is really cyberspace on the internet, and you can create your own community. You can create your apps, your decentralized applications, and you can develop an economy around that community and the apps you create. And I believe these communities, they'll be consist of people all around the world. They won't be from a particular country, particular state, political state, but it will be all over the world. It could be someone from South Korea, some from Lebanon, some from the US, some from EU. And all these individuals, they will be attracted together by a common ideology, whether it's a philosophy or it's a way of life, a certain idea that's going to unite these people together. They're going to connect on the internet, and the community will be governed, will be managed, by a decentralized council, very similar to the decentralized council governance model of Hedera Hashgraph, and it will issue its own currency, digital currency, of course, but it's decentralized. So all the members of this online community can participate in managing, creating, and controlling this currency. So everybody will be a stakeholder in this community. And I think that's it's a very idealistic vision, of course, of Dr. Beard. But I believe that's the trend. That's the innate desire of average folks. Not the elites, of course. The elites, they have their multi-million-dollar yachts, and they're already supranational. Many of them, they have houses all over the world. They have several passports, different kind of identities. To them, they're already there. It's for the common folks. So in the future, I believe common folks, the idea of nation states will become more and more blurred. People will be less identified with, oh, I'm Chinese, I'm American, I am Lebanese, I'm Brazilian. I think that's, nationalism will be less pronounced in the future. What's going to replace that is this online identity. It's the because people are already spending a lot of time online nowadays, and I think that online community in the future is going to replace nation states as we know it today. I know right now, the U.S., not only in the U.S., in EU, in China too, there's a backlash of nationalism, and people say this wave of nationalism is going to usurp the progress that globalization had been making for the past 3 decades. I think, it's just like, nothing goes up straight, just like stocks or cryptocurrencies. Everything goes in cycles, in waves. And for the past 30 years, we have the pendulum swing towards globalization. And now it's going to swing back a little bit. It's not going to swing all the way back to pre-World War II, for example, where nation state, the idea of nation state is very, very well defined. But it's going to swing back somewhat. And we already see that with the election of Donald Trump, the elections of Boris Johnson in England, the Brexit, this backlash against globalization. But I think globalization is a mega trend, is the trend that's going to persist in the future. Maybe not now, but once this pendulum swings back, we will see that. And that's when I think globalization for the next stage is going to move into cyberspace. It's going to be decentralized. And Hashgraph, cryptocurrency, especially Hashgraph, the platform, is at a very good place to capitalize this this shift of ethos, this zeitgeist. And I think that's one thing that the mainstream media in the US, they don't get. I think many of them, they probably haven't visited China for a while. They haven't been to China. They don't realize how resilient the Chinese economy is. And they believe that US might be winning the trade war. I can tell you that's not the case. US is digging itself into a very big hole. I hate to say this because I'm a US citizen. And, for the longest time of my life, I was very antagonistic towards the communist regime of China. But I believe the right way to compete against China is not bring China down. It's not through conspiracy or through these manipulation in the background, try to cause trouble in China, try to collapse the Chinese regime. I think the best way to compete in any situation is to build yourself up. Self-improvement, for no better words. I think U.S. is not doing that. U.S. is trying to find ways to manipulate the situation to, create trouble for China. So to slow down the progress of China. I think that's the wrong approach. It's very similar to what Simon Sinek. If you search for Simon Sinek, he has many YouTube videos. A very big advocate for millennial generation. He had this concept of you play an infinite game versus playing a finite game. U.S. is playing a finite game. It views China as a competitor, as an enemy, and he's trying to sabotage the enemy to gain an advantage. Whether the means of sabotaging was open and honest, or was it nefarious and underhanded, very conspiratorial? U.S. doesn't care about that. As long as China loses, U.S. wins. That's all the policymakers care about. And I think that's the wrong approach. I think U.S. became powerful because the leaders in the past in America played the infinite game. They never really view any enemies out there as this competitor. It just says, let me just build my country to as best as I can, to make the people as strong as they can be, as smart as they can be, as hardworking as they can be. And we can, at that time we don't need to compete anyone. The business in the world will flow to us. And prior to World War II, I think U.S. did a really good job in that front. But I think right now it's because they saw China just rise out of nowhere. Like 40 years ago, China was in the same situation as North Korea. It has nothing. And after 40 years, it's competing head-to-head with the U.S. And to the policymakers, they feel very threatened. And in response to that being threatened feeling, they decided, let's sabotage China. We can accuse them of stealing our secrets. I think the accusations of Chinese companies stealing U.S. trade secrets, does it exist? Yes, it does. But it's not the majority. It's just like, yes, there are many thieves out there, anywhere, in China, in the U.S. too. Or there are people stealing company secrets all the time in both American and Chinese corporations. But those are the minority. Those are probably less than 10% of the employees you have in the company. The majority of people you hire, you work with, they're honest, they're okay employees. They're not thieves. Same thing with China. China is not going to build itself up if it only relies on stealing trade secrets. Did it happen? Of course it did. Just like, in the U.S., companies, they steal each other's secrets. Companies, the competitors like Coca-Cola and Pepsi, Dell and HP, they steal each other's secrets to gain a competitive edge. But that's not their main competitive advantage. China, same thing. Their competitive advantage is a very educated population. They're very hardworking, very diligent, and they save a lot. They save a lot of assets to invest. And if you attribute the rise of China only to them stealing trade secrets, I think that's unfair. And what it does, and also it passes the responsibility of the decline of the American society and American economy to external power, to external factor. And that's not going to help us. It's kind of like if I'm a drug addict, if I'm addicted to pornography, for example, and if I'm addicted to playing video games all the time, and because of those addictions, I do bad in school. And I see a kid, who a couple years ago was the last of our class, and all of a sudden, within a couple years, became the first in class. Instead of blaming myself, instead of saying, I gotta shape up, I gotta stop watching pornography, I gotta stop smoking, I gotta stop drinking, I gotta shape up and compete. Instead of doing that, I say, you know what? Let me cause an accident so this new kid will fall and break his legs, so he could, so he won't be able to take the next test. Or let me borrow the books from the library, all the books in the library, so this kid here will not be able to borrow the same books and study. That's not the right mentality. I understand. Many colleges, maybe that's the competitive, cutthroat culture. But I don't think that's the right way to compete. I think the right way to compete is really to find your shortcomings. Why is this kid beating me? You know, and improve on that. That's what China did. You know, China 40 years ago, it was like North Korea. It realized it messed up. You know, it messed up since 1949 when communist government took over, and that's why Deng Xiaoping, he opened up China. He became a student, and he let China become a student to the world. And China, for the past 40 years, had viewed the West, especially the U.S., as its teacher, and it humbly studied the strength of the U.S. and copied the strength, and enabled itself to become stronger, more powerful, to a certain point that, you know, right now it made U.S. feel like it's very threatened, even more so than USSR did during the Cold War. So this video has been going on pretty long. I'm not gonna, you know, I meant to talk about you know, the latest depreciation of the yuan. Didn't really meant to go into a tirade of comparing the U.S. to China, but I just want to share my thoughts with you. You know, coming from someone who lived in China, who know a lot about China, and I think there's a lot of noise out there, especially in mainstream media. I think they don't really know the objective situation between U.S. and China, and I would want to give people a heads up. I think U.S. wants to create an economic and political crisis in China, but I think I'm afraid in the attempt of doing that, it's going to hurt itself. And we saw that yesterday in the big drop in Dow Jones. And I believe that's only the beginning. I think the real crisis is going to be next time when we see Dow Jones drop 10%. Or we have another repeat of 1987 when Dow Jones dropped 22%. The Fed is going to come in, you know, slash raise to zero and start coming with QE 4, 5, 6 within 6 months. And at that time, you know, nobody's going to buy the U.S. Treasuries except the Fed. And China is going to, you know, announce we have 10,000 tons of gold in our reserve. We're going to start selling bonds denominated in RMB and take a major step in replacing the dollar as the international reserve currency. And you see all the other countries that used to be allies of the U.S. flocking to China because these allies had been pushed around by the current administration for so long. They just want to have any alternative to the U.S. hegemony, the U.S.-based system. And that's when you see the U.S. dollar lose its international reserve currency status. And that's when you see a plunging of living standard here in America. Of course, that's a very bad scenario. It's probably a low likelihood scenario, but it is a possibility. It's actually a very good probability this is going to happen. And I think when that happens, you know, we will see social turmoil in this country, unprecedented. And that's not going to be a very pretty scene. So right now is certainly not the right time to take risks. It's time to be conservative and hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next time.